Living relationships with microorganisms have particular terms with definitions that we use in biology. Here's an example of some lichen. Lichen are actually two different microorganisms living together in what we would describe as a symbiotic relationship. Symbiosis is an intimate relationship between two organisms living very closely together in such a manner that they're interdependent. And if you separate the two individual entities that are living closely together in a symbiotic relationship, there's a good chance that one or both of those partners in that relationship cannot survive without the other. That's somewhat true of lichen. Lichen are actually a composition of different types of algae and fungi that have adapted over a long period of time or have evolved to be codependent on one another, but in a very beneficial way. We have the algae that are the colored items or entities that capture sunlight and produce oxygen and various nutrients as a result of their photosynthesis. The fungi provide scaffolding or a place for the algae to live. These organisms have had this type of close relationship for so many thousands of years. When we take a look at the macroscopic appearance, the yellow sort of fuzzy looking one on a piece of branch at the top right, the brownish lichen that are growing on what appear to be a surface of the rock, and then the type of lichen that you might be more familiar with, which is sort of a leaf-like tiny greenish structure that might be growing on the bark of a tree. Um, those are all lichen. They're both algae, fungi, structures living together, and if you try to take the two apart, they really don't survive well without the other. When we have two organisms living in symbiotic relationship and they both benefit, the specific term that we use to describe that relationship is mutualism. So a mutualistic symbiotic relationship is where both partners benefit. Another example of a mutualistic symbiotic relationship is illustrated in here, these images of root from particular kinds of plants called legumes. A legume would include clover, alfalfa, even peanuts and peanut plants. In these roots, the root tissue of these types of legume plants are capable of allowing a certain type of bacteria into the root tissue. These bacteria are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And when we see the growth structures of the nitrogen fixing bacteria that have become intimately related to or growing in the tissues of the plant roots, we'd see them in the form of nodules. Now, if you look at the microscopic appearance on the lower left corner, you can see that the bacteria, in our example, is a genus called Rhizobium, not the only nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but it's a really common example. So Rhizobium is capable of capturing molecular nitrogen, which is in the form of a gas, in our atmosphere. Most of the gas that you're breathing in our atmosphere is nitrogen. That's the predominant gas. And we can't utilize that nitrogen into directly. We have to have some other organism capture that nitrogen for us, what we call fix it or attach it to other atoms of other elements, and put that nitrogen into our food chain or our food web. So the rhizobium can capture the nitrogen, molecular nitrogen gas, attach it to other atoms of other elements into more useful forms, first for the plant to use as a form of fertilizer so that the plant can grow really well. And you can see that the bacteroids, or the actual cells of the bacteria, really do have themselves embedded into the cells of the plant roots. Once they're there, the rhizobium, for example, produces two various types of proteins that have very different functions. One is nitrogenase. Nitrogenase is the key enzyme that's going to actually do that nitrogen fixing, capturing characteristic. Another interesting protein made by rhizobium is leg hemoglobin. Leg hemoglobin, as the name implies, is going to allow this organism to sense and tolerate or detect any kind of different gases in its surrounding atmosphere, like oxygen. If you take a look at the ruler on the right and compare it to the size of the little nodules on the plant roots, you can see that the nitrogen fixing nodules are very tiny. The scale on the ruler, the tiny marks are millimeters, and so you can see that some of these nitrogen fixing nodules aren't quite a millimeter in diameter. So they are fairly tiny, but they're very important for the successful growth of many different types of agriculturally important food crops, or even plants that we rely on using to feed our domesticated agriculturally important animals, like clover for grazing animals like cows. So these bacteria forming fertilizer, or allowing fertilizer type materials to form for these plants, is vitally important for the success of our whole planet. Because if these organisms weren't capturing nitrogen for us to then eventually consume in plants and animals that we use for food, we just wouldn't see the types of living organisms that we do see here on Earth. So for clarification, like hemoglobin is a nitrogen or oxygen carrier. It's very similar to the type of oxygen carrying molecule that we might see in animals. So this is a great example of using a bacterium that has a protein or some type of biochemical that's similar to something we might find in mammals, including humans, and use that as a tool for study as to how that particular molecule functions. Nitrogenase is, again, a key enzyme responsible for capturing molecular nitrogen and attaching it and creating it into other more useful forms that other organisms, including us, can possibly use. In addition to rhizobium, we also find that cyanobacteria also can be very efficient nitrogen fixers, and we need those nitrogen fixers in our food chain. A second category of symbiotic relationship is commensalism. In commensalism, one partner benefits, but the other one is not harmed. And a nice, actually aesthetically pleasing, at least I think, image of a commensalistic symbiotic relationship is this foraminifera. The foraminifera is the globular looking structure in the center of this photo. It's actually a single-celled organism that has a shell as an outer covering. The shell has a variety of different types of openings or pores on the surface. Through these openings or pores, you can see these long tendrils. These long tendrils are actually extensions of the single cell that's captured or living inside of the shell. The reason it's extending these little filaments is, of course, to capture nutrients and essentially sense its environment. And you'll notice these little golden things or colored materials that are sort of stuck to the tendrils or even stuck to the shell itself. So those little golden structures are actually golden algae that have attached to the foraminifera and have established this commensal symbiotic relationship. We have a nice benefit for the golden algae because it has a great place to live and probably can avoid predation by living with this foraminifera. A third category of symbiotic relationship that catches our attention is parasitism. In parasitism, one partner benefits, but the other is harmed. That is the type of symbiotic relationship that always catches the attention of human beings. And here we have an example of a symbiotic relationship that's parasitic between a locust, which is an animal in the form of an insect that can completely devastate agriculture by consuming plants in a field or any kind of vegetation right down to the ground. It'll eat stems, leaves, grains, everything, and poses a major threat to the food security of many people in the world. There is a parasitic microsporidian microorganism, Antonospora locusti, that can infect the cells of the locust, and by doing so, it actually disrupts this devastating eating pattern, it's often described as swarming, that locusts can do. So here we have the example of a parasitic relationship that, at least from our point of view, is pretty beneficial for us, but it's devastating for the locust because it does dramatically change its growth and eating pattern. For biome, what is a biome? It's a total complex of organisms living in some part of the world. Now, we've modified that term and we use the word microbiome. Microbiome are the different types of microorganisms that are living in and on the human body. Some are going to be mutualistic, some commensal, and some, unfortunately, parasitic. It's the first two categories that don't catch our attention, but are very beneficial. And if you notice, from head to foot, we have a wide variety of different kinds of microorganisms on our body. What happens when we change our microbiome? Then we might open up the possibility of a pathway or portal of entry for unwanted organisms to start to grow and colonize, and then result in possibly an infection, an unwanted growth of microorganism in the wrong place at the wrong time.